الصوت برضه واضح انت يعني So, good afternoon. Thanks for your interest in this session, side event about third state's responsibility in preventing genocide in Gaza. In particular, the focus for our speakers today is on the role of national human rights institutions, your role in making pressures on your corresponding states so as they abide by their obligations under treaty and customary international law to prevent genocide in Gaza, and most importantly for now, to put an end to its killing machine that is now taking place. Let me start by welcoming the speakers and the audience. We are looking forward to a fruitful discussion at the end with a brief time for Q&A. Since we need to finish this session around 14:55, let's start immediately making good use of every second. May I ask the speakers to stick to their assigned time, just in case you are beyond the assigned time. I'll try to give you a sign or you see the time limit there. So I count on your understanding. Unfortunately, there is no translation available, so the working language will be English. And in case two of the statements will be in Arabic, I'll try to summarize the main points at the end. So let's start immediately by in the statement and presentation by Ammar Dweik, the General Director of the Palestinian Independent Commission for Human Rights. To you the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to first thank our co-organizers of this side event, the Arab National Human Rights Institutions. I apologize for my voice. I have strong flu. Please. Yes. Also, I extend gratitude to all speakers and everyone in this room. Thank you for joining us. I also would like to seize this opportunity to extend special thanks to all national human rights institutions around the world who have supported us during the challenging past months. Their efforts, including statements of solidarity and support, sending messages, engaging with their governments, and organizing specialized workshops to discuss the situation in Palestine, have been invaluable to us. Today, the war on Gaza, characterized by acts of genocide, enters its 8th month. It also has been over 100 days since the International Court of Justice, ICJ, ordered the State of Israel to stop all acts of genocide, stop incitement and using dehumanizing language against Palestinians, ensure humanitarian aid delivery at the needed scale, and submit a report back to the government. Furthermore, it has been over 40 days since the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 278, which demands an immediate ceasefire and the aid provision in Gaza. Despite these all calls, the situation on the ground continues to deteriorate. Genocide acts persist, and the humanitarian crisis deepens, taking a new horrific levels of human suffering. Today morning, the occupying force launched a new military operation in Rafah with a blatant disregard to all calls and warnings by international community. We are deeply concerned for the lives and safety of over 1.3 million Palestinians crowded into that narrow city. Due to the ongoing genocide and the destruction of all aspects of life, this is a multi-layer, multi-dimensional genocide. Gaza has become an uninhabitable place. The situation is likely to lead to a persistent and profound humanitarian crisis, along with a significant potential migration, which could seriously impact the security and stability of the region and beyond. Israel's disregard for the UN Security Council resolutions, International Court of Justice rulings, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, along with its disdain and disrespect to the UN agencies and other relief organizations, has made international law, international order, international humanitarian system a secondary casualty of the war. This disregard has undermined human rights principles and weakened our efforts to promote them in the region, fostering growing skepticism towards human rights and international law among peoples in our region and globally. The genocide in Gaza is distinguished by its visibility. It unfolds live in full view of the global audience. This visibility places a profound moral and legal test before humanity. The 1948 Genocide Convention not only requires member states to refrain from committing acts of genocide, but also mandates them to act to prevent it if there are risks of occurrence. In Gaza situation, the ICJ has made it clear that there are reasonable grounds to believe that Israel has violated this convention, and therefore obligating all member states to intervene and to trigger the erga omnes principle. The critical situation now, under this context, the question arises what role national human rights institutions should play. In this context, we would like to offer the following recommendations. First, we encourage NHRIs to effectively promote the right to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, particularly for individuals participating in solidarity demonstrations, and should advise their governments to respect principles of legality, proportionality, and necessity in any possible restrictions on these rights. Equally, national human rights institutions should play a pivotal role in addressing issues such as anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, other forms of racism, and any discourse that promotes hatred or violence. NHRIs should urge their governments to actively promote the enforcement of international law and the ICJ resolution. This promotion can take place in international forums or at the bilateral level. We also encourage NHRIs to advise their governments to consider economic and political sanctions against the State of Israel. These measures could be coordinated with other nations to increase pressure and ensure a unified international response. We also encourage NHRIs to talk to their governments to support or join other countries in legal actions at the international courts, including the ICJ, similar to the actions taken by South Africa and Nicaragua. We also advise NHRIs to talk to their governments, and we encourage them to review and potentially adjust bilateral agreements with Israel to include clauses that emphasize the importance of adhering to international law, including specific references to human rights protections and international humanitarian law, and the obligations under the Genocide Convention. Support for human rights advocacy. We encourage our NHRIs to talk to their governments to increase funding and support to NGOs and international organizations that work in the field of human rights, particularly those that monitor and report on issues related to genocide and other severe human rights violations, whether in Palestine or elsewhere. National human rights institutions can encourage their governments to work collectively to restore faith in the principles of human rights and international law, which have been severely undermined by the war on Gaza. In conclusion, as our partners in the Global Alliance for National Human Rights Institutions, and as leaders in promoting and protecting human rights principles in your countries and around the world, we expect your urgent action and communication with your governments. We at the Independent Commission for Human Rights are always ready to provide you with any additional information may you need. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ammar, and I think you will distribute your presentation to those who are willing. Now I give the floor to Mrs. Mushira Khattab, the chairperson of the Arab Network for National Human Rights Institutions. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's a great honor to be part of this panel. I would like to add my voice to what Mr. Ammar al-Duwayk mentioned about the role of NHRIs. My intervention will complement what was said, and I am really focusing on the responsibility of state parties, especially third party. The UN General Assembly declared by Resolution 96/1 on 11th of December 1946 that genocide is a crime under international law contrary to the aims and spirit of the United Nations, and to the same effect, Article 1 of the Convention on Genocide, the same is articulated. Article 1 defines genocide. Article 2 stipulates the actions that are considered genocide, and Article 3 criminalizes the participation in the genocide, even the instigation. To come to the International Court of Justice, the court has ruled that Israel may be carrying out genocide and should take specific steps to stop, without any change in Israel behavior, what can and should be done. The extraordinary scene of food airdrop to beleaguered, malnourished civilians in Gaza was truly an insult to human dignity and to humanity. And the 8,000 or 80,000 packages of food, 38,000 ready-to-eat meals dropped to beleaguered and malnourished Palestinians in Gaza is really a drop in the ocean. Considering the stranded trucks queued outside the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, recently underscored the desperate plight of Gaza civilians and the world's willful failure to help them. The airdrop presented a tiny proportion of the needs of the Gaza besieged and bombarded civilians who are on the brink of a famine, largely of Israel's making, and breaches the Genocide Convention and a flagrant violation of the International Court of Justice ruling of 26. It represents failure of a third-party state to shoulder their responsibility under international law. While supporting what Mr. Ammar al-Duwayk said about responsibility of NHRIs, we must not lose sight of the fact that state parties, governments, bear the primary responsibility to prevent and criminalize any action of genocide. And countries are obliged, governments are obliged to formulate legislation that criminalizes genocides. Extradition of perpetrators of genocides should be granted, and genocide is a crime that does not fall by time. I'm short of the English expression, statute of limitation. It remains a crime and it should be punished. NHRIs can flag the issue, but states have measures of implementation of genocide that must be implemented, and going to treaty bodies, state will have to report on their implementation of the genocide agreement. Special attention must be given to very vulnerable groups such as children and their families. And we have climbing figures of people who lost their lives. Now we're approaching 35,000, and mostly children and civilians. So really, the international community must act, and it must act now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Madam Mariam Al-Atiyya, Chairperson of the National Human Rights Committee in Qatar. You have the floor, Madam.
مساء الخير جميعا. سأتحدث باللغة العربية وستتم الترجمة بعد ذلك. السيدات والسادة ممثلي الجهات الشريكة بالتنظيم، السيدات والسادة مقدمي أوراق العمل، الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بداية أود أن أشكركم لحضوركم معنا اليوم لاستكشاف السبل في منع حرب الإبادة الجماعية التي يشنها الجيش الإسرائيلي منذ أكثر من 200 يوم على الشعب الفلسطيني الأعزل في قطاع غزة. هذه الحرب التي أحدثت دمار ومآسي وانتهاكات تفوق ما ارتكب خلال الحرب العالمية الثانية. وبالنظر لهول ما يحدث على مسمع ومرأى من العالم أجمع، لا بد من وقفة للمجتمع الدولي وفق مسؤولياته في حماية المدنيين العزل، حيث بلغت الجرائم الإسرائيلية ضد المدنيين العزل أقصى مستواها، ما جعل الحياة في قطاع غزة مستحيلة، مستكملا جريمته المستمرة في إبادة الشعب الفلسطيني في قطاع غزة، وهذا ما نعتبره في القانون الدولي إبادة جماعية. السيدات والسادة، في هذا السياق نجتمع هنا اليوم لحث الدول على احترام قرارات محكمة العدل الدولية وقرارات مجلس الأمن التي تدعو إلى وقف القتل والتدمير وضرورة إدخال المساعدات الإنسانية إلى قطاع غزة، ولمناقشة وتوضيح أدوات أصحاب المصلحة ومنها المؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان للعمل على وضع الدول أمام التزاماتها كأطراف ثالثة بالقانون الدولي، وهذا لخدمة الشعب الفلسطيني الأعزل وخدمة الإنسانية جمعاء، لكي لا تتكرر في زمان ومكان آخر ما يحدث للشعب الفلسطيني المظلوم والمقهور، ولإعادة الثقة بالقانون الدولي والشرعية الدولية لحقوق الإنسان وأدواتها وفرض مبادئ هذه الشرعية بما يساهم في حماية الأمن والسلم الدولي. السيدات والسادة، بجهودنا معا نستطيع حث حكومات بلادنا للاطلاع بمسؤولياتها كأطراف ثالثة في القانون الدولي للضغط على إسرائيل لوقف حرية الهمجية وعدوانيتها على قطاع غزة، ولوقف الإبادة الجماعية التي يتعرض لها الشعب الفلسطيني ولمعالجة آثارها. وكل أمل أننا بجهودكم ومؤازرتكم سننتصر للإنسانية ومبادئ الشرعية الدولية وأدواتها على آلة القتل والدمار والظلم والطغيان، متوحدين معا في مسيرة تعزيز وحماية وصون الكرامة الإنسانية. شكرا لكم.
You may have the copy of the statement, but just a few sentences that were mentioned after thanking the organizers too, that we are gathered here today to urge countries to respect decisions by the International Court of Justice and United Nations Security Council, which call for an end to killing and destruction and the necessity of delivering humanitarian aid to Gaza, and to discuss and clarify the tools of stakeholders, including national human rights institutions, to compel countries to fulfill their obligations as third parties under international law. Then at the end, she urged our governments to fulfill their responsibilities as third parties in international law to pressure the Israeli occupation to stop its barbaric war and aggression on Gaza, to stop the genocide against our Palestinian people and to address its effects. And she ended by being hopeful that with your support and your efforts, humanity, the principles of international law and its instruments will prevail over the machinery of killing, destruction, injustice, and tyranny, united in a march to enhance, protect, and preserve human dignity. Thank you very much. Now, I'll give the floor to Sayyid Sultan. I'll give Sultan bin Hassan al-Jammali, the Secretary General of the Arab Network for Human Rights Institutions. You have the floor, sir.
السيدات والسادة الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أود أن أشكركم لحضوركم ومشاركتكم معنا في هذه الندوة الهامة التي تنظمها بالتعاون مع عضوي الشبكة العربية للمؤسسات الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان، الهيئة الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في فلسطين، واللجنة الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في قطر، والتي ننظمها لنبحث معا سبل مواجهة تعنت وتكبر الاحتلال الإسرائيلي في تنفيذ قرارات أدوات الشرعة الدولية، وكذلك لتحديه وانتهاكه وتنكره لمبادئ هذه الشرعة. واصلين من خلال نقاشنا اليوم لرؤى يمكن من خلالها العمل على وقف جريمة الإبادة الجماعية التي يتعرض لها شعبنا العربي الفلسطيني، وكذلك لتوضيح الأدوات الحقوقية التي بين أيدينا والتي تؤهلنا لحث دولنا على الاطلاع بمسؤولياتها كأطراف ثالثة في القانون الدولي لوقف الانتهاكات الجسيمة والإبادة الجماعية التي يتعرض لها الشعب الفلسطيني في قطاع غزة. السيدات والسادة، لقد فرض العدوان الإسرائيلي بنتائجه القاسية والمستمرة امتحانا صعبا لحركة حقوق الإنسان. هذه الصعوبة التي كان أحد أسبابها التأييد الغربي لسياسات الاحتلال الإسرائيلي العدوانية بدعوى الدفاع عن النفس، وتناسى أصل القضية المتمثلة في الاحتلال وعدم مشروعية استمراره، وطبيعة الاحتلال الذي يشكل أسوأ أشكال الاستعمار بطبيعته التوسعية والاستيطانية والعنصرية، والذي يعمل على هضم حقوق الشعب الفلسطيني الثابتة والمشروعة وغير القابلة للتصرف. مع ذلك لم تتخاذل الشبكة العربية للمؤسسات الوطنية حقوق الإنسان ومنظمات المجتمع المدني في المنطقة العربية عن النهوض بمسؤوليات إدانة العدوان والدعوة لوقفه وإنهاء الاحتلال ومحاسبته على جرائمه، حيث دأبت الشبكة العربية وفق قرار جمعيتها العامة الاستثنائية والتي عقدت في مصر أبان العدوان الإسرائيلي على قطاع غزة سنة 2014 على مؤازرة الهيئة الوطنية لحقوق الإنسان في فلسطين حتى انتهاء الاحتلال ونيل فلسطين استقلالها مهما طال الزمن. وكلنا إيمان بأنه وبنهاية المطاف وبعد كل هذا الصبر والكفاح والتضحيات سينال الشعب الفلسطيني حريته واستقلاله وحقه في تغيير مصيره. فكما قيل: للباطل جولة وللحق دولة. ولا يصح إلا الصحيح، وذلك باحترام وتفعيل الشرعة الدولية لحقوق الإنسان وتنفيذ قرارات آلياتها وأدواتها، وذلك من خلال تعاوننا لوضع الدول أمام مسؤولياتها كأطراف ثالثة بالقانون الدولي لوقف جريمة الإبادة الجماعية بحق السكان المدنيين في قطاع غزة، منفذين قرار محكمة العدل الدولية. السيدات والسادة، إنما يقوم به جيش الاحتلال الإسرائيلي انتهاك صارخ للقانون الدولي الإنساني وللقانون الدولي لحقوق الإنسان ضمن معاهدة لاهاي، وذلك باستهداف المدنيين والأعيان المدنية وحصار قطاع غزة، ما يشكله ذلك من جريمة حرب موصوفة مكتملة الأركان بما تتضمنه من جرائم إبادة وجرائم ضد الإنسانية وفق القانون الدولي. لذلك وبالنظر لصلة وقرب المؤسسات الوطنية المنشأة وفق مبادئ باريس لعام 93 من صناع القرار السياسي في الدولة وأفضليتها في التأثير بحكم هذا الموقع، تلتمس الشبكة العربية للمؤسسات الوطنية حقوق الإنسان من مؤسساتكم الموقرة حث حكومات بلدانكم للاطلاع بمسؤولياتها كأطراف ثالثة بالقانون الدولي، والضغط على الاحتلال الإسرائيلي لإجباره على تنفيذ أوامر محكمة العدل الدولية بما يسهم في منع الإبادة الجماعية في غزة ووقف العدوان وتوحيد الجهود لفتح ممرات آمنة لدخول المساعدات والجهات الإغاثية، والتعاون في مساءلة ومحاسبة مجرمي الحرب الإسرائيليين، والله ولي التوفيق ومن وراء القصد. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you very much. You can have also a copy of the statement. He concluded with calling indeed the actions of Israeli occupation army that they constitute a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including the Hague Convention, by targeting civilians and civilian objects and on besieging Gaza Strip. This amounts, he says, to a complete war crime, including acts of genocide and crimes against humanity under international law. Therefore, the Arab Network for National Human Rights Institutions seek from your esteemed institutions to urge your governments to fulfill their responsibilities as third parties in international law and to pressure the Israeli occupation to comply with the orders of the International Court of Justice. This will contribute to preventing genocide in Gaza, ending this aggression, and unifying efforts to open safe passages for aid and relief agencies, and cooperating in holding Israeli war criminals and their partners accountable. Thank you very much for your statement. Now I'll give the floor to Ms. Lucy McKernan. She's the Deputy Director for United Nations at the Human Rights Watch. You have the floor, Madam.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you who've come to listen to us today, and thanks very much to the organisers for the event, the Arab Network for NHRIs and the Palestine Independent Commission for Human Rights. I'm from Human Rights Watch, and so I thought I would talk to you today a little bit about what we're doing in relation to the conflict in Gaza, researching both with people on the ground but also with our contacts in the region, and also through digital methods. What's happening on the ground, and then analysing that information to determine to what extent the parties are complying or not complying, should I say, with international law. And I was just discussing before with my colleague Anisha that this is a conflict where we do have international legal bodies very engaged from many different angles, and I think there are other conflicts that we work on where this is not the case. So that is good to see. We've got 2 cases before the ICJ. We've got the ICC prosecutor investigating crimes. We've got the Human Rights Council mandated Commission of Inquiry investigating, despite the fact that they have no access to the areas. And of course, the Special Rapporteur on the OPT, who's also making assessments about what's happening in Gaza. In her most recent report to the Human Rights Council, she found reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating the commission of the crime of genocide has been met. So, the legal system and the human rights system are doing their jobs, and yet we're still seeing devastation and massive violations of international law in Gaza continuing every day. So the topic today is, what role is there for third states to ensure compliance with international law, and especially the ICJ orders. And so I thought I would describe a little bit the orders, also what Human Rights Watch's findings are in relation to those orders, and then what third-party states can do. So starting first, with the orders of the ICJ, there, of course, the orders first came out on the 26th of January. They made orders to Israel to prevent acts of genocide, to make sure its military doesn't commit acts of genocide, to prevent and punish incitement to genocide, to take immediate and effective measures for the provision of humanitarian aid, and to preserve evidence. And it's the third one, the one about the provision of humanitarian aid, that we have been working on in most detail. And you will have seen then, of course, on the 28th of March, there was a second round of provisional measures orders from the court. The court indicated that Israel had not complied with its order, and it said, and I quote, "In view of the worsening conditions of life faced by Palestinians in Gaza, in particular the spread of famine and starvation, they decided then," end of quote, "they decided to impose a more detailed provisional measures order requiring the government to ensure the unimpeded provision of basic services and aid in full cooperation with the UN, including by opening new land crossing points." And I think it's notable that this was a order that was delivered or given unanimously. Unlike most of the other orders given by the court, this was a unanimous decision of all judges of the court. And so what has Human Rights Watch found in relation to these orders? So we found now on two different occasions that Israel is not complying with the orders in January and in March in relation to the provision of humanitarian aid. At that time, we found that Israel was continuing to deliberately obstruct the provision of basic services and the entry and distribution within Gaza of fuel and life-saving aid, also undertaking acts of collective punishment that amount to war crimes and include the use of starvation of civilians as a weapon of war. We found that fewer trucks had entered Gaza and fewer aid missions had been permitted to reach northern Gaza in the several weeks since the court's ruling, the first ruling in January, than in the weeks preceding. And that was based on also data from the United Nations. We had already made a finding in December that Israel was using starvation of civilians as a weapon of war, which is a war crime. This was based on our findings that Israel was deliberately blocking delivery of food, water and fuel, that it was willfully impeding humanitarian aid, that it had apparently deliberately razed agricultural land, that it was depriving the civilian population of objects indispensable to survival, such as bakeries, and that the Israeli authorities had done the above pursuant to a policy set by Israeli officials and carried out by Israeli forces. Then in April, Human Rights Watch researchers went to Egypt's North Sinai region for further research, and we spoke to workers from 11 UN agencies and aid organisations who were sending aid to Gaza, or trying to. And based on that research, we made a further finding on the 2nd of May that Israel is still failing to comply with the ICJ orders. We found that Israel continues to obstruct the provision of basic services and the entry into Gaza of fuel and life-saving aid. We found that while there had been a modest increase in the numbers of trucks allowed in, an opening of additional crossings and a port to let aid in, still this was nowhere near enough aid was being allowed into Gaza. We found that the average number of aid trucks into Gaza through the Kerem Shalom and Rafah crossings increased by only 24 trucks a day in the month following the 28 March ICJ order compared to the month before. And this is only about 37% of the number that had entered Gaza each day before the October 7, 2023 attacks. And I just wanted to give you a little bit more detail about what we found in terms of the obstruction of humanitarian aid. We found that there was an opaque process for the inspection of shipments and deliveries, that the Israeli authorities had provided no list of items that were barred from entering into Gaza, that they had, in some cases, denied items that were dual use or used for both military and civilian purposes, but there was no clear list of what those items of dual use items were, and that inspection staff were rejecting entire trucks of aid and in an ad hoc manner without providing any explanation for why the shipments were rejected and not affording humanitarians any opportunity to appeal a rejection decision. We also found that after being inspected first in Egypt, then humanitarian trucks must go into Israeli-controlled inspection sites. Trucks often have to wait days and sometimes weeks to be inspected at those two sites due to limited working hours and limits on the scanning machines, as well as the additional inspection procedures that had been imposed since the October 7 attacks. One UN employee said a truck full of medical supplies had been sitting at the border for a month and still had not been inspected by Israeli authorities. According to aid workers, most of the items they're trying to transport into Gaza are being rejected at the two inspection sites within Israel. They said the Israeli authorities have rejected most items that include things like solar panels, motors, metal parts, and any other items being stored in wooden crates. And they said the Israeli authorities are also consistently rejecting items like generators, water filtration systems, and oxygen.
Excuse me, time is over. If
Okay.
you can, just in 1 minute, go to how national institutions can
Sure.
pressure. Just 1 minute, please.
So in this context where we have all of these restrictions, of course the humanitarian situation is worsening by the day. We just had the executive director of the World Food Programme saying that there is a full-blown famine in the north of Gaza at the moment. So, moving to the question of, what states can be doing in this context. Third states could, and in our view, should be doing a lot more. States, of course, have a legal duty under the Genocide Convention to prevent acts of genocide. States also with strong political links to the state concerned have a greater duty to use their influence in this regard, as the duty to prevent genocide varies from state to state depending on its capacity to influence. In our view, states should be using all forms of leverage that are available to them, including sanctions and embargoes, to press the Israeli government to comply with the court's orders in the genocide case. Governments should impose targeted sanctions, including travel bans, asset freezes against officials and individuals who are responsible for the continued commission of the war crimes of collective punishment and the deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid, and using starvation as a weapon of war. And we've seen that this sort of pressure has worked in some cases to change Israel's actions. I was going to give some examples of some of those things that states have already done, but I might finish up there. Perhaps we can come back to that later. But our bottom line is to say that states should can and should be doing a lot more to ensure that the orders of the ICJ are implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we will have time in Q&A to go further in the issue. Now I give the floor to Ms. Anisha Patel, member of the Governing Council of Law for Palestine. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers for this timely discussion. It has been 8 months today since Israel began its genocidal assault on the Palestinian people in Gaza. Since last evening, we've been watching as the already displaced people sheltering in Rafah have been asked to evacuate while Israel continues to decimate Gaza. As the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory outlined in her last report to the Human Rights Council here, genocide is a process. It is not a process that began in October, neither is it one that is restricted to the Palestinian people just inside Gaza. It is one that has been going on for several decades and has been brought upon the people across the region. Against this background, I will briefly outline the responsibilities that are incumbent upon third states under international law to prevent this genocide and to not be complicit, in turn to kind of direct at what the national institutions should be pressuring their governments to focus on. As my colleagues have already outlined, on 26 January 2024, the ICJ in its provisional measures order determined that it is plausible that Israel is committing the crime of genocide. And it asked Israel to take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of acts in the convention. The court reiterated this in more concrete terms in the second PMO of 28 March 2024 and went further to establish that famine was setting in. The effect of the ICJ's determination is that states must proceed on the basis of the plausibility that Israel is in fact violating the obligations of the Genocide Convention, including prevention and commission of the crime. This, by extension, means that states violate their own obligations arising from the Genocide Convention and generally international humanitarian law if they provide aid or assistance, financial, technical, or material, including arms, to Israel, while it violates international obligations. The case brought by Nicaragua against Germany at the ICJ for participation in the ongoing plausible genocide and serious breaches of international humanitarian law and other preemptory norms of international law is an example of what the possible ways of ensuring third states' accountabilities can be. Even though the court decided not to order provisional measures at this stage, particularly, it rejected Germany's request to dismiss the case and affirmed the duty of all states, whether or not they're party to the conflict, to employ all means reasonably available to them to prevent genocide. They also mentioned that this included obligations on Germany as a state party to the convention in its supply of arms to Israel. These indications by the ICJ have an effect on the judicial actions happening also at the national courts. Law for Palestine, along with our partners at PIPD and ELSC, have supported such cases under the Justice and Accountability for Palestine initiative. The ongoing cases in the Netherlands and Germany that focus on halting arms exports by these states to Israel are examples of how national laws can be used and the ICJ PMOs can be leveraged to ensure that states are doing everything they can to prevent the genocide from continuing and to not be complicit in this process. The ICJ also affirmed the continuing catastrophic living conditions of the Palestinian people in Gaza, particularly in light of the prolonged and widespread deprivation of food and other basic necessities. In light of the time at hand, I will not elaborate on the disastrous consequences of states cutting funding to the UNRWA. But as the UN officials have repeatedly stated, the UNRWA is the only agency that has the capacity on ground to support the people in Gaza, and it is critical that states ensure that the UNRWA has the necessary funding as well as access to comply with the obligations of preventing genocide. The other aspect to this is enabling individual criminal prosecutions to happen nationally or internationally as a key means through which states can discharge their legal obligations to prevent and punish the crime of genocide. At the international level, we at Law for Palestine, with the support of the Independent Commission for Human Rights and the Arab Network for National Human Rights Institutions, made a communication to the ICC on the legal characterization of the crime of genocide being committed by Israeli leaders against the Palestinian people. Endorsed by more than 15 national human rights commissions and institutions present here today, this 250-page legal analysis includes an 8-fold discussion on the genocidal intent of the Israeli War Cabinet. This includes statements made by leaders dehumanizing and decivilizing the Palestinian people. The submission also highlights the various actions and official policies of the Israeli government, such as the well-documented ethnic cleansing, ecocide, domicide, deliberate destruction of culture, and the policies of apartheid. All these elements have been reinforced by the UN Special Rapporteurs and other special mechanisms, so it's not something that hasn't been discussed in this forum before. When looked at collectively, the statements and the systematic actions provide a reasonable ground for issuing arrest warrants for committing the crime of genocide as per the standards set by the ICC in its previous cases. Since March 2021, the investigation into the situation of Palestine has been open at the ICC without any concrete actions, which is very different from the case of Ukraine, for example. Instead of pushing the ICC to do its job, as South Africa and some other members of the Assembly of States parties have done, we have watched as elected officials in states issue threats to the ICC staff if they proceed with issuing arrest warrants for Israeli leaders. This is absolutely antithetical to what the functioning of the international legal order is supposed to be, and it is incumbent upon third states to ensure that these mechanisms remain impartial and carry out their duties so as to ensure that the crime of genocide can be prevented and punished as was envisioned when the convention was written up. Nationally, members of Israeli forces at different levels can be prosecuted for crimes before the national criminal processes of states on the basis of universal jurisdiction. Over the last 7 months, we've also seen extensive mass mobilization against this genocide by people on the streets, port and dock workers, unions, and students. We have also seen extensive repression of states when shutting down these mass movements of solidarity in complete violation of freedom of expression and assembly. Even if this may not directly qualify under the Genocide Convention per se, but the international legal obligations of states, including human rights obligations, outline this as a violation. National human rights institutions are uniquely positioned between states and civil society and hence carry the responsibility to ensure that the states are held accountable to the international and legal frameworks that they operate in. The institutions also have the duty to safeguard civil society actors and human rights defenders. Ensuring governments abide by their international legal obligations, including under the Genocide Conventions, but also the Geneva Conventions and humanitarian and human rights norms, is critical to maintain the legitimacy of this international legal order. In this moment, it is critical that all of us, including the civil society and the national human rights institutions, act collectively to ensure that this legal order that we operate in doesn't lose its legitimacy. Palestine is at the core of this legal order. It has been baked into this legal order from its formation. So it is incumbent that we act to prevent this genocide and punish the actors involved in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Since we have only 10 minutes for question and answers, I should ask you please to be brief with a comment or a question. Then we'll go back to the speakers if they want to comment. And I'm using also my privilege as chairperson to make a question to Lucy. If you can, in 1 minute later on, go ahead with what exactly you suggest that states should do in order to prevent genocide, third states in order to prevent genocide to taking place. So you mentioned the embargoes, travel bans, freezing assets. So if you can go ahead with the other suggestion. But let's have a tour and have some questions. Please go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Raghunath from Malaysia. My question is, what can Ganri do about what's happening in Gaza? We've heard this whole today presentation on the annual report on AFP, but nothing has been said about Gaza. Is it possible for us to move a resolution on Gaza that it is genocide and Ganri as a whole must take a position on what's happening in Gaza? Secondly, can we set up a task force or task committee to take action and what collective action Ganri and also the NHRIs can do in respect of what's happening in Gaza? Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? I'll go take a few others before giving the floor to the speakers. Do you have any comments or questions? It's a signed event of Ganri meeting, so the question is, what can Ganri do in that sense? Okay. So we have the chairperson of Ganri. You can go ahead with the very brief, please. بطريقة مختصرة.
طيب أجاوب بالعربي.
أوكي أنا بعدين.
بخصوص دور الجانري في هذا الحدث يعني اللي فعلا يضايق أي شخص على وجه العالم. الجانري في بداية الحدث أصدرت بيانين. البيان الأول تم يعني شجب ما حدث في غزة من الأحداث ومن القتل وكذلك في اجتماعنا في الدنمارك الأخير الذي كان في نهاية العام الماضي تم إصدار بيان آخر كذلك يتحدث عن هذا الموضوع بشكل يعني مخصص.
There are two statements already that were done in that perspective by Ganri.
وتم حث جميع المؤسسات الوطنية التابعة للجانري للموافقة على إصدار هذا البيان. وهذا تقريبا دور الجانري.
All parties of the national institutions actually were consulted and to adopt that statement in their name.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much.
I really want to. The situation, wait, yeah. The situation is really very, very serious. We are going through a crisis of human rights. It has become very flagrant, double standards in human rights. Israel used to claim that it is the only democracy in the Middle East. South Africa has brought Israel to the International Court of Justice on the account of serious violation of international human rights law, international humanitarian law, flagrant. Genocide we're talking about is genocide through starvation, genocide through forced eviction of innocent civilians from homes they've been living in for hundreds of years, and now they're being forced into battlefield. No safe corridors, and we've seen the evasion of a sustainable ceasefire, and now there isn't even a hope for the people in the region. There is no hope for the people in the region, and hope is a legitimate human right. So we must act, but we should not live in the illusion that we as NHRIs have the competence to deal with this situation. It is the obligation of state parties to the Genocide Convention to implement the convention and to bring those responsible for breaching human rights to justice. This has not happened now. We have the International Court of Justice provisional measures, but questions are raising concerning the Security Council. What will the Security Council do? We've seen the United States exercising veto against the right of the Palestinian state to become full member of the United Nations. What does this mean? It means that the state of Palestine will not be able to implement the human rights of its citizens, and it will also mean that Resolution 181 on the two states in 1948 is implemented halfway through to establish the Israeli state, but when it comes to the Palestinian state, no action is taken. So we are going through a crisis of human rights. And this has very negative impact on our part of the world in the Middle East. We have a very nascent, fragile human rights system trying to flourish. Now, those against human rights are becoming stronger because they see double standards. We cannot pretend that we as NHRIs alone can do something. We are only assistive devices to states, but the primary responsibility lies on the states. First party, second party, third party, whatever, it's the states.
Thank you very much. Since we have limited time, let's focus, please, in the responses about what options do we have as national human rights organizations. We still have things to do to pressure on states. So Lucy, I give you the floor to go ahead in 1 minute or two about what you think, other ideas, how, and then Ammar. And then we conclude, I think.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead, Lucy.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I really agree with the comment just made by our colleague on the panel. So, you know, as I said, in our view, states should be using all forms of leverage that are available to them, and that will differ depending on the states, you know, the amount of levers that they, influential levers that they have. And that includes sanctions and embargoes, political and economic pressure on Israel, to press Israel to comply with the court's orders. But also governments should be imposing targeted sanctions, things such as travel bans and asset freezes against individuals, because of course individuals are involved in the implementation of these policies and the actions that we're talking about. So they should be against officials and individuals who are responsible for the continued commission of the war crimes that we've discussed before. And I wanted to give just some of the examples of what we've seen. I think it's also important for states to be publicly underlining the importance of the ICJ, its provisional orders, the fact that they are binding and calling for compliance. Also, as Anisha pointed out, pushing back against attacks against these legal institutions like the International Criminal Court that we've seen, joining the ICJ cases. For instance, we heard that Ireland has announced that it will intervene as a third party in the case brought by South Africa. We've seen Algeria trying to pass a resolution at the Security Council, which would have underlined the importance of the ICJ's binding orders. I think this is really important. It was, of course, vetoed by the US. We saw in the UNGA in March, states publicly echoing that the ICJ orders are binding and must be complied with. We would encourage that. We also, of course, have made a call that all states should cease their arms transfers to Israel and to Hamas. And a number of states have taken action in that regard, such as Italy, Canada, Spain, Belgium, the Netherlands, Slovenia. They've all announced curbs or halts to their arms transfers. So Israel's allies then, of course, like the US, the UK, France and Germany, also need to put in place, suspend their arms transfers. Spain and Ireland, within the EU context, have demanded an immediate assessment of whether Israel is complying with the human rights obligations that are stipulated in the main trade deal between the EU and Israel. So that's another form, I think, of pressure that can be applied. I mentioned targeted sanctions before. We've, of course, seen targeted sanctions by the UK, the US and the EU against settlers in the West Bank and extremist right-wing groups. But what we want to see is similar sanctions put in place in relation to those responsible for the commission of crimes in Gaza. Other states have used diplomatic pressure, like cutting off diplomatic relations or recalling ambassadors and so on. And then just finally to mention, of course, Anisha already talked about the suspension of aid to UNRWA. States, of course, should be reversing those suspensions in the current context and in compliance with the ICJ orders. And we have seen a number of states who initially suspended and now have reversed those decisions, but some still have in place suspension of aid to UNRWA. Thank you.
Thank you, Ammar. In 1 minute, please, because we are running out of time.
I will outline four positive examples of how NHRIs came to support Palestine and the Palestinian National Human Rights Commission. First, as mentioned, almost all Arab national human rights institutions endorsed the communication that was submitted to the Office of the Public Prosecutor at the ICC. It was a well-researched submission, and the endorsement, I think, gives leverage to this submission. Second, I don't want to mention names, but many NHRIs, they reached out to their governments, some privately, some even wrote public letters, asking their governments to play an active role in the South African case and to consider joining the case. Third, some NHRIs, particularly in Europe, played an important role in pushing back against the blank ban against freedom of assembly under the pretext of the anti-Semitism. And they promoted the idea of legality, proportionality, and necessity. So I believe NHRIs can always play this moral and legal and rational role in their respective states to encourage their governments to take action that are consistent with their obligation under international law.
Thank you very much.
One last example also, I don't want to mention names, some NHRIs in the countries that decided to cut off funding on UNRWA, we reached to some of them, and they privately reached to their governments and encouraged them to revise their decision concerning cutting fund on UNRWA. So I really appreciate all these supports. Some prefer not to be visible. Others organized webinars, like the Mexican Human Rights Commission. They organized a big webinar about Gaza, and they made a statement, a declaration. Also the same with Turkey. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the speaker. This session is over, but genocide is still taking place. So we have things to do, and as we noticed, there are still ideas around the table, just political will and some activism that you had already started. So thank you very much for your interest, and hopefully without genocide taking
Thanks
place.
for the moderator.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. شكرا
سلامتك والله ما
الله
شفت
يذكر والله امبارح